In 1845, a silent killer swept through the fields of Ireland. Within weeks, the potato plants that fed millions of people turned black and collapsed into rotting mush. The stench of decay hung over entire counties. Families who had survived for generations on almost nothing but potatoes suddenly had nothing left. Over the next 7 years, roughly 1 million people starved to death. Another million fled on overcrowded ships, many of them dying before they ever reached land. It remains one of the worst humanitarian disasters of the 19th century. And at the center of it all was a single lumpy, dirt-covered root that most of Europe had refused to eat only 100 years earlier. But the real story of the potato begins thousands of years before any European ever saw one. Around 8,000 years ago, high in the Andes Mountains of what is now southern Peru and Bolivia, wild potato plants clung to rocky slopes above 12,000 feet. These were nothing like the large golden tubers we know today. They were small, some no bigger than a walnut coat. Bitter and genuinely toxic, they contained solanine and tomatine, compounds that could cause nausea, vomiting, cramps, and, in high doses, death. The indigenous peoples of the highlands learned the hard way that eating them raw was dangerous. But over generations, they discovered a method. They soaked the tubers for days in freezing mountain streams, then subjected them to repeated cycles of freezing and thawing. The process leached out the toxins. Through careful selection of the least bitter plants, they slowly bred the poison out, and the starch indeed, long before anyone understood the word genetics. By the time the Inca rose to power in the 1400s, the potato had become extraordinary. Farmers on the steep, terraced fields around Cusco and across the highlands cultivated more than 3,000 distinct varieties, in roans: yellow, deep purple, red, white, almost black. Each was adapted to a specific altitude, soil, and microclimate. The Inca did not simply grow potatoes. They built an entire agricultural science around them. They also solved the storage problem that would later baffle European farmers. Fresh potatoes rot. In a world without refrigeration, that is a serious problem. The Inca created chuño. They spread harvested tubers on the ground, let them freeze solid overnight, then trampled them barefoot the next day to squeeze out the moisture. After several days of this cycle, they were left with light, chalky, bone-dry blocks that could last 5, 8, even 10 years without spoiling. Chuño fed armies on long campaigns and entire cities during lean years. The potato was not just a crop in Mos.
It was the foundation of one of the largest empires in the pre-Columbian Americas.
When Spanish conquistadors arrived in the 1530s hunting for gold and silver, they barely noticed the ugly tuber that the local people ate at almost every meal. The message was obvious without being spoke. If the king himself needed armed guards to protect these plants, they must be extraordinarily valuable. Frederick's clever trick worked. According to the story, Prussian peasants began sneaking into the royal garden at night to steal seed potatoes for themselves. Whether every detail of this legend is historically accurate remains debated among scholars, but the result is beyond dispute. Within a single generation, the potato had become a major staple crop across Prussia and much of northern Germany. Parmentier had been a pharmacist serving in the French army during the 7 Years' War, and he had been captured by Prussian forces and held as a prisoner of war for 3 years. He did not die. He did not contract leprosy. He did not lose his mind or his morals. In fact, he came out of captivity in surprisingly decent health. He hosted elaborate dinner parties for Parisian high society, where every single course from appetizer to dessert was made from potatoes. A few potatoes eventually reached Spain around 1570, mostly as cheap ship provisions and food for the poor and the sick. There were no celebrations, no royal proclamations. The rest of Europe reacted with suspicion and outright horror. Wheat, barley, and rye grew above ground in the sunlight, noble crops, gifts from God. The potato grew underground in the dark. It was misshapen, covered in strange eyes, and belonged to the same family as deadly nightshade. To many Europeans living in deeply religious, superstitious societies,
This was not a botanical coincidence. It was a warning from God himself. The rumors about potatoes spread faster than the crop itself ever could. In parts of France, the potato was formally blamed for causing leprosy. The Parliament of Besançon actually banned potato cultivation in 1596 on the grounds that it spread the disease.
In Russia, the Orthodox Church called the potato the devil's apple and warned that eating it was a sin against God. In parts of Germany and Switzerland, people believed potatoes caused flatulence, uncontrollable desire, scrofula.
Scottish Presbyterians refused to eat potatoes because the word potato appeared nowhere in the Bible.
For nearly 200 years after arriving in Europe, the potato sat in gardens mostly as a botanical curiosity.
Wealthy people grew it as an ornamental plant. Its delicate purple and white flowers were considered quite attractive.
Marie reportedly wore potato blossoms in her hair at French court events. Botanical gardens in cities like London, Seville, and Vienna displayed potato plants alongside other exotic specimens from the New World.
Scholars wrote papers debating whether the tuber was edible, medicinal, or dangerous. But actually eating the thing on a regular basis, that was beneath the dignity of any respectable European. Potatoes were animal feed at best and a mark of desperate poverty at worst. In England, even the poorest labourers considered it an insult to be offered potatoes instead of bread. The class associations were unmistakable. Bread was civilized. Potatoes were not.
For a while, the potato seemed stuck in this humiliating position. A rejected, misunderstood crop. That did not last. War changed it, famine changed it, and a handful of stubborn, slightly eccentric leaders changed it. The first major turning point came in the Kingdom of Prussia. Frederick II, known to history as Frederick the Great. And he had a very specific problem. His country kept getting dragged into devastating wars with neighboring powers. And during these wars, enemy armies would burn Prussian wheat fields to starve the population into submission. Grain was easy to destroy. You just set fire to it and watched it burn. But a crop that grew underground, completely hidden beneath the soil.
An invading army could march right over a potato field without ever knowing that dinner was 6 inches below their boots.
Frederick saw the military potential immediately. In 1756, Frederick issued the Kartoffelbefehl, which translates roughly to the potato order. He commanded Prussian peasants to plant potatoes or face the possibility of having their ears and noses cut off.
The peasants predictably were not enthusiastic. They thought potatoes were disgusting, fit only for livestock.
According to one widely repeated account, villagers in the town of Kolberg sent a message to the king saying that potatoes had neither smell nor taste. Instead of threatening his subjects, he planted a royal potato garden on the outskirts of Berlin and stationed uniformed soldiers around the perimeter to guard it.
Meanwhile, across the border in France, a man named Antoine was fighting a similar battle with even more flair. During his imprisonment, the primary food his Prussian captives gave him was potatoes.
He did not die. He did not contract leprosy. He did not lose his mind or his morals. In fact, he came out of captivity in surprisingly decent health.
He hosted elaborate dinner parties for Parisian high society, where every single course from appetizer to dessert was made from potatoes. And then he pulled a version of the same stunt Frederick had used. He planted a large potato field in the sandy,
posted armed guards during daylight hours to make the field look important, and then conveniently pulled the guards away every night so that curious Parisians would come steal the plants. Antony was essentially running a one-man public relations campaign for the potato decades before the concept of public relations even existed.
And it worked. By the late 1700s, France had finally begun to accept the potato as human food.
Today, the French still honor hachis. The classic dish, hachis, which is essentially a French version of shepherd's pie. There is a Paris metro station named after him, a boulevard, a hospital. The man gave his life to a root vegetable, But while France and Prussia were slowly warming to the potato through clever marketing and royal endorsements, something very different, and this is where the story of the potato takes its darkest turn. Ireland in the 17th and 1800s was under British rule, and the vast majority of Irish land was owned by English and Anglo-Irish Protestant landlords, who often lived. Irish Catholic peasants, who made up the overwhelming majority of the population, were tenant farmers working tiny plots on land they did not own. British policies like the penal laws had systematically restricted what Irish Catholics could inherit, what they could buy, what families were pushed onto smaller and smaller plots of increasingly marginal, rocky, boggy soil. Many families survived on plots of... The potato was perfect for this brutal situation, almost as if it had been designed for it. 1 acre of potatoes could produce enough food to feed a family of 6 for an entire year. The potato grew in poor soil where grain would fail. It grew in the wet. It required almost no equipment or investment to plant or harvest. You did not need a plow, a horse, or a mill. A family could survive on potatoes and buttermilk, and almost nothing else. Potatoes provided carbohydrates, vitamin C, vitamin B6, potassium, and even some protein. Add buttermilk and sustain it, it did. Ireland's population exploded from roughly 3 million people in 1700 to over 8. The potato made that astonishing growth possible. But there was a catastrophic flaw built into this dependency. And anyone who understood agriculture could see it coming. All of Ireland's potatoes came from a single variety. Farmers did not grow multiple types. They grew one. This meant that every potato field in every county, if a disease could kill one plant, it could kill every plant in Ireland simultaneously. There was no genetic diversity to fall back on, no resistant variety waiting in reserve, and absolutely no plan B. The entire food supply of an entire nation rested on one genetic line of one crop, planted in one way. The clock was already ticking. Ireland just could not hear it yet.
In the late summer of 1845, a cargo ship carrying potatoes from the Americas docked at a European port. Hidden within those potatoes were microscopic spores of an organism called Phytophthora infestans. The blight spread across Belgium and the Netherlands first, destroying potato crops as it went. Then it crossed to England, and then it hit Ireland. The effect was almost instantaneous and absolutely devastating. Farmers would walk into their fields and find that entire acres of green. When they dug up the tubers, hoping to salvage something, they found that the potatoes themselves had turned to foul-smelling pulp. The stench of decaying potatoes became so overwhelming in parts of Western Ireland, in counties like Mayo, Galway, and Clare. The first year was devastating. But what turned a bad harvest into an apocalypse was that the blight came back. It returned in 1846, worse than before, and again in 1847, and again in 1848. Families who had no other source of food began dying in their homes, on the roadsides, in the ditches beside the fields. Diseases like typhus, cholera, and dysentery swept through the weakened, malnourished population. Entire villages in the west of Ireland were depopulated. Workhouses built to hold a few hundred people crammed in thousands and mass graves. Between 1845 and 1852, roughly 1 million Irish people died of starvation and the diseases that followed it. Another million immigrated, many of them on ships so overcrowded and disease-ridden that they became known as coffin ships. Passengers died by the dozens during Atlantic crossings, and their bodies were thrown overboard. Ireland's population dropped by roughly 25% in less than a decade, and the country never recovered that number. Even today, nearly 180 years later, the population of Ireland is still lower than it was before the famine struck. The British government's response to the crisis made everything worse. While Irish families starved, Ireland continued to export grain.
Relief programs were slow, underfunded, and attached to degrading conditions. Starving men had to perform hard labor. Charles, the senior British Treasury official overseeing famine relief, described the catastrophe as the judgment of God. He wrote those words in official government correspondence, not in private. The famine was not simply a natural disaster. It was a natural disaster made catastrophically worse by political indifference and deliberate policy choices.
If the potato had lifted Ireland up, the blight brought it crashing down in the most horrific way imaginable.
And the consequences rippled far beyond the island itself. The million Irish immigrants who fled the famine did not simply disappear into the world. Massive waves of Irish immigrants poured into the cities of the eastern United States into Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, where they faced discrimination, poverty, and anti-Catholic hostility, but also where they built communities, labor movements. Irish immigrants settled in Liverpool, Glasgow, Melbourne, and Toronto. They carried with them a deep generational anger toward the British government. That would fuel Irish nationalist movements for decades to come, and eventually contribute to Irish independence in 1922. And by the 21st century, the country was growing over 90 million metric tons per year, more than any other nation. The Great Famine did not just empty Ireland. It planted Irish communities, Irish culture, and Irish grievances across the English-speaking world.
And the reverberations of that scattering are still visible today.
But here is the strange and unexpected part of this story. The famine did not destroy the potato's reputation.
If anything, it proved beyond any doubt just how indispensable the crop had become. The lesson the world took from Ireland was not that potatoes were too risky to grow.
The lesson was that you should never stake everything on a single genetic variety. Grow more types, breed for resistance, diversify.
Plant breeders in Europe and the Americas began developing new potato varieties with resistance to Phytophthora infestans. Agricultural scientists established seed potato programs to ensure genetic diversity. The disaster that nearly destroyed Ireland became the catalyst for a new era of scientific potato farming.
And that is exactly what happened in the decades that followed. Russia had actually been fighting its own potato battles. But Russian peasants resisted violently. In the 1840s, forced potato planting campaigns triggered what historians call the potato riots, where entire villages rose up against government officials who were trying to make them grow the crop. Peasants burned potato fields. Despite this resistance, the government eventually won out. By the 1850s and 60s, a combination of government pressure, agricultural reform, within a few decades, Russian peasants were growing potatoes as a core staple alongside bread. By the early 1900s, Russia had become one of the largest potato producers in the world, and rural communities had given the potato a revealing new nickname. They called it the second bread. In China, European traders and Christian missionaries had introduced the potato during the 17th century. But it remained a minor curiosity for a long time. That changed when Chinese farmers in the mountainous interior provinces of Yunnan, Sichuan, the potato filled a gap that no other crop could. By the mid-19th century, China had become the largest potato producer on Earth. And by the 21st century, the country was growing over 90 million metric tons per year, more than any other nation. India followed a parallel trajectory. British colonial officials had introduced the potato to the Indian subcontinent in the late 1700s. But it took decades for the crop to spread beyond small experimental plots. Once Indian farmers adopted it, production grew rapidly. Today, India is the second largest potato producer on the planet, and the crop feeds hundreds of millions of people across the subcontinent. The potato has become so embedded in Indian cuisine that many people forget it is not native to the region at all. Across Africa, the potato arrived later, but spread with surprising speed. Countries in the East African highlands, places like Kenya, Ethiopia, Rwanda, and Uganda, adopted potato cultivation during the 20th century. The United Nations and the Food and Agriculture Organization have called the potato one of the most important tools for fighting hunger. Globally, the potato is now the fourth most important food crop on the planet, behind only wheat, rice, and corn.
More than 300 million metric tons of potatoes are produced every single year across more than 150 countries. The sheer scale of what we do with potatoes today would stun an Inca farmer. The sheer scale of what we do with potatoes today would stun an Inca farmer.
French fries, which likely originated in Belgium or France sometime in the late 1700s, are now a multi-billion-dollar global industry.
Americans alone eat roughly 50 pounds of frozen potato products per person per year, most of that in the form of fries.
The potato chip, which legend says was invented in 1853 by a frustrated chef in Saratoga Springs, New York, has become its own enormous industry. The average American consumes about 30 pounds of fresh potatoes and another 17 pounds of potato chips every year. But potatoes are far more than just food, and this next part tends to catch people off guard.
Potato starch is used in manufacturing to make paper, textiles, adhesives, and biodegradable plastics.
Vodka, one of the most consumed spirits on Earth, has been traditionally produced from potatoes in Poland, Scandinavia, and Russia for centuries. During the Second World War, German industrial chemists figured out how to convert potato starch into synthetic rubber for military vehicle tires. Potato derivatives show up in pharmaceuticals, cosmetics, animal feed, and even the adhesive on the back of postage stamps.
The potato, it turns out, is not just feeding the world. It is holding parts of the industrial world together.
And in 1995, the potato became the first vegetable ever grown in outer space. NASA and the University of Wisconsin successfully cultivated potato plants aboard the Space Shuttle Columbia as part of research. It grows in poor mineral-heavy soil. It produces more calories per acre than any grain crop. It requires relatively little water compared to rice.
It stores well in harsh conditions. It provides a broad range of essential nutrients.
The same qualities that made the potato indispensable in the Andes 8,000 years ago make it the leading candidate for feeding human beings on another planet.
Think about that for a second. A crop that the Spanish considered beneath their notice, that the French officially blamed for leprosy, is now the leading candidate for the first food humans will grow on Mars. The potato started as a small, poisonous weed clinging to rocky slopes above the clouds in South America. Indigenous farmers spent millennia transforming it into something extraordinary. The Inca built an empire on top of it. The Spanish ignored it. Europe feared and despised it. It fed the explosive growth of Ireland. And when it failed, it killed and displaced millions, reshaping the entire demographic map of the Atlantic world. It survived its worst catastrophe and went on to become one of the most important crops in human history. Not bad for a lumpy root vegetable that nobody wanted.
If you enjoyed this, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us which part of the potato's history surprised you the most. And make sure to like this video so more people can find it.